Hey everyone, it's Leon, and today I'll be doing my analysis of the Shogi Wars game that I played a few days ago. But first, I want to quickly list down 2 points. Firstly, I've accidentally disabled the comments on my previous YouTube video, and I've since enabled them. So please do write a comment if you have any kind of questions or opinions regarding the position, and I'll be happy to answer them. However, I must also add, please do refrain from hurtful or inappropriate language. Let's keep the discussions fruitful and wholesome for everyone. The next point is that I've been speaking really quickly during the real-time games. This is due to the nature of the time controls, but for the analysis, I intend to slow down and give a more thorough discussion of the game. So let us begin. My opponent once again was Static Rook, playing as Sente, and I played Gote Fofarok. And the opening stage went about pretty normal. The first point I want to talk about is that my opponent went for this early knight to 3, 7, and pawn 4, 6 shape. Essentially, his signaling interest is starting up an attack on the fourth file. And during the game, I mentioned that keeping the silver on 3-2, guarding the bishop is a good idea. Because the point is, if I move the silver up to 4-3 at this stage, there is this idea where my opponent attacks on the fourth file. Point being that if I take it, he can exchange the bishops, knight recaptures, and now the bishop no longer guards the 2-4 square, so he can attack on the second file, right? So already this is a successful attack for my opponent, and it is a good game for him. That being said, it's not necessarily bad to move the silver to 4-3 at this point. For instance, it's possible to just go to 5-2, and let's say pawn to 5-4, pawn to 5-6, and pawn to 5-4, and this is still a difficult game. So silver 4-3, not necessarily bad, but it also allows my opponent an early attack opportunity. In the actual game, I kept the silver on 3-2, so this does not allow my opponent the chance to play pawn to 4-5. Right? In the actual game, I played go to 5-2, so if he went for this attack, it's no longer going to work. I'll just take it. He can exchange the bishops. This time I can recapture with the silver, and the silver still protects the 2-4 square. My opponent has just given up the 4-file pawn for free, and this is a good position for ranging her. So moving back, my opponent didn't attack. He didn't have a good attack, so he just played pawn 5-6, and we continued with pawn to 5-4, pawn 1-6, pawn 6-4. And so far, the next few moves are pretty natural development moves. And now, I'm sure this is the key position where many players would probably be very confused. In the game, I mentioned that moving up the knight to 7-3 at this point is actually a bad move, and I would already be losing at that stage. It may come as a surprise, but let's try to break down this complicated position bit by bit. First of all, the strategy that my opponent is aiming for is called subway rook. The plan is that he wants to move up all his pieces away from the bottom rank so that his rook can go down to 2-9 and then shift over to 1-9, right? Setting up an edge attack with the bishop, knight, lance, and the rook. So it is quite a convoluted plan. There's a lot of preparation involved, right? The pieces need to move here, you need to go 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 here. So there's a lot of preparation involved. But when all the pieces are eventually in place, there's going to be a really strong edge attack coming. So what are the key features of subway rook? First of all, the bishop being on 6-6 and the silver being on 4-7. These are the two specific squares, right? The silver here and bishop here, which are telltale signs that your opponent is going for a subway rook. Point of bishop 6-6 is to basically first move away the bishop so that there's space for the knights and the silver to move up, which eventually allows the rook to use the open bottom rank. So let's just briefly talk about like what happens after knight to 7-3, naturally going for high mino castle. And there are a lot of different options, but I just want to try to be as simple and straightforward with the explanations. So first of all, my opponent will just continue with his plan. He's going to play, let's say, go 6-8. And at this stage, let's say I play 0-4-3, he plays knight up. And I push this pawn, he pushes this pawn. All right, there is still a couple more preparation moves that my opponent needs to do. He needs to play rook here, lands here, and rook to 1i before he can set up the edge attack, right? So there's a little bit of time here. The question is, how does ranging rook use the time that he has now to set up any kind of active ideas? So let's quickly run through some options. First of all, let's say I shift the rook over to the third file. This time I'm trying to set up an attack here, right? Well, it's not going to work so well because my opponent will just move the rook to 2i. And the moment I try to move the bishop here, at this timing, to open up my rook's file, my opponent would attack with pawn to 4-5, right? Look at this, the bishop no longer protects this diagonal. He is already moved here, right? So now this diagonal is really weak and my opponent has a very good attack. So this third file rook idea is not really good. How about let's not attack, right? Let's just wait. All right, now in this case, I have a really strong 4-piece castle. Unfortunately, my opponent is aiming directly at the H file, right? And none of these 4 generals are actually actively helpful in protecting the king. So again, my opponent will just move down the rook. And the unfortunate thing is that you can't push pawn 2-4, you can't push pawn 8-4, right? Aiming for silver crown because the bishop also targets this pawn. So here there is not really any active plans that you can do here. You kind of just have to wait like a sitting duck. Maybe silver here, lance here, and at this stage, maybe you can try pawn push, bishop here, silver up, but already you're a little bit too late. The attack is coming, right? Bishop lands rook. This push is very, very dangerous. And so for this reason, moving up the knight to 7-3 is dangerous. I mentioned in the actual game because having the knight placed here will have at least guarded the edge and make it safer for my king. All right, so we mentioned that rook to 3-2 is not very good. We mentioned that just waiting, trying to make a 4-piece castle is also not very good. And how about we go for central rook? Well, the thing is that in the actual game, there was also like sort of a central rook attack idea, but in this case, none of the generals are participating in the central attack, right? So this is a very light attack with just the rook, and unfortunately, it's not going to be good enough. For example, my opponent can play rook to 2-9, and let's say I push the pawn here. My opponent would move the bishop to 4-8 in this case, just to be safer. 4-8 is a little bit safer than 5-7. Point being that after I play pawn 5-5, pawn takes, rook takes. At this point, my opponent has a lot of thickness in the center. So actually, he does not need to drop the pawn back here. And instead, he can use the opportunity that Gote made a pawn trade, right? Sente can actually leverage on the opportunity that Gote made a pawn trade, and now Sente has a pawn in hand to set up an attack on the second file. So for example, it goes pawn push, pawn takes, pawn drop here, right? And then bishop takes, rook takes on 2-6, and this is very good for static rook. And the unfortunate thing is that even though Gote has managed to trade a pawn on the center, his manor pieces, right, his bishop, his knight, they're all not participating in the center file attack. Meanwhile, Gote has many generals, right, protecting the center. So this attack on the center is too light. So there's a lot of things to talk about, but basically the main idea, right, having gone through all of that, the best idea to counter this strategy is to actually set up a central rook's attack, by the same time also bring a general up to help add more firepower. It's a very strange idea, right? Like you break the middle castle shape with this silver up move, but the point is that the left silver cannot easily participate in the central attack in this position, and so that's why you do it with the right silver instead. It's a very advanced level of thinking, so it could be pretty hard to follow. But the idea is you do need to bring a general to help support the rook in the central file's attack. And so the best way to do it will be with the right silver, as I did in the actual game. All right, and then the game continues here, here, here. And now I mentioned in the actual game that I have two options. The aggressive option is to go for pawn 5-5. And after pawn recaptures, I can play rook 5-2. This time I have the silver supporting the rook, so the attack is a lot stronger. But at the same time, attacking in this position where my generals are all over the place can be dangerous. Objectively, it's not bad. It's just that I would say it's up to personal preference, because the other option is what I did in the actual game to try to fix the structural weaknesses in my position. The downside of that will be it allows my opponent to attack first. So it's just a matter of, do you want to attack first, insist on having the initiative, but with a camp structure being a little bit weaker, right? There could be dangers that lurk around sometime in the future, or you could choose to play it safe but allow your opponent to attack first. I think both mindsets are pretty much okay. I went for 0-4-3, right? And then now, because of that, my opponent started the attack. He went pawn 4-5, goes 7-2, pawn 2-4, pawn takes. Now, the third point I want to mention here is that all along I mentioned that I think the key attacking idea for my opponent is to play bishop takes 2-4, right? Point being that after bishop takes 2-4, rook 2-2, one of the ideas that I was considering is that he goes ahead with bishop takes 3-3 promote, effectively giving up his bishop for the rook, but he's able to win a silver in this case. So this is a very interesting position. Gote is down a rook, Gote is down a silver in material, but he has two rooks in hand. And Sente's castle is not very good at defending against two rooks. So for example, if we could continue with dragon takes on 1-9, and now you cannot take the knight here because of a rook fault, right? It hits the horse and it hits the knight, threatening a devastating check. So it's game over. And besides that, it's pretty difficult to defend the eventual rook drop to 2i for my opponent. Maybe the best option is to drop a silver on either 5i or 7i, right? Let's say he drops a silver 5i, defense against the attack first, but anyway, still rook drop 2i, attacking the knight now, applying a lot of pressure on the center file. And this is actually a really difficult position to navigate for my opponent. For example, let's say he plays horse takes on 4-4, aiming to capture the lens. Well, now that the pawn on the 4-4 has been eliminated, I can play pawn drop on 4h. And actually, this is a devastating attack. He cannot recapture this pawn with either of his generals. So this is game over. However, after bishop takes 2-4, rook 2-2, my opponent could continue with pawn 2-5, and actually this is a very difficult game. For example, Gote can continue with pawn 6-6. The point is to set up bishop 6-6 eventually. First you sack the pawn, and after let's say recaptures, now I can play pawn takes 4-5. And now look at this, the moment the knight takes this pawn, I can immediately escape my bishop, taking the pawn on 6-6, threatening active counterplay. So this is a very good idea for ranging rook. Maybe my opponent will instead play takes on 3c, and it continues knight recaptures, pawn push, bishop drop, rook down, bishop takes, and this is a really hard game. Maybe it's slightly better for ranging rook, but in practice, this is close to 50-50. In the actual game, my opponent played pawn takes on 4-4, silver takes, and pawn drop on 4-5. I mentioned during the game that I did not really understand the meaning of this move, because here, ranging rook will simply play silver back to 5-3, and already I felt that the position is very close to losing control. Center is very close to losing control of the position, because look at this. Now ranging rook has an active bishop, and his rook is also starting to get a little bit more active. For the time being, maybe not so much, but at least his bishop is already very active, aiming down on this diagonal. Meanwhile, ranging rook always enjoys the safer king, right? His king on the 8th file is further from the battlefield compared to the opponent's king. So he has a safer castle, and the moment his major pieces start getting active counterplay, it becomes really hard to handle the position for static rook. Yeah, so already at this stage, I felt that my opponent was starting to already have a hard time in the position. Static rook is very close to losing control because of how active ranging rook's pieces are. In the actual game, he played pawn to 3-5, pawn takes, bishop takes, rook to 3-2. And actually, there's already a threat of bishop takes on 8h, right? Promote with check, opening up a discovery on the opponent's bishop. So, for example, let's say my opponent passes a turn, the threat will be to take this, right? It comes with check, so he has to recapture, and then the rook falls. I'm up a silver, and this is game over for my opponent. So here, during the game, I thought that the most natural defense was pawn drop 3-4. And I was thinking after pawn drop 3-4, the bishop will go here, bishop takes, rook here. Maybe I can just show it quickly. Bishop here, bishop takes, rook here, pawn drop. And then I'll sabaki the bishop again to 8-4, aiming down on this diagonal. So again, I feel like this is a very difficult position to navigate for my opponent. My major pieces are becoming very active. This bishop is aiming down on this diagonal, threatening to promote into a horse. This rook can sacrifice itself anytime for the bishop, and in sort of way actively use itself via exchange. And meanwhile, of course, ranging rook still has a very safe castle with the king far from the fight. So as long as his major pieces are active, he'll have a very comfortable advantage. However, in the actual game, my opponent played bishop to 4-6, which is a mistake because it allows me to drop a pawn on 3-6. Now this pawn attacks the knight, and the problem is if he recaptures, I can take this silver on AH with check. And after king takes, I can take this silver, exchanging my bishop for 2 silvers. That's a very good trade. I'm out material. And on top of that, I have an attack on my opponent's bishop. This bishop is also really hard to defend, right? My opponent cannot drop a pawn here because that's illegal. He also doesn't want to, let's say, drop a bishop here just to defend, right? It is very inefficient. So I mentioned during the game that maybe he'll defend by moving up the gold, but it's still not good because I will also discard my rook for the bishop, and then I'll push this pawn. Point being that if it takes, I have this bishop fork, right? So at this stage, Rangerook's attack is connecting really well, whereas Static Rook's castle is already completely in ruins. So this is an unplayable position for my opponent. And instead, he played pawn drop 3-4 at this timing, which is really good defense. He held on to the position really well from here moving onwards. I went ahead with bishop takes 8h promote, king takes, rook takes, and rook 3h. Now in the actual game, I mentioned that there are many possible attacking ideas. 0 to 4, 9, 0 to 2, 7, pawn takes on 3, 7, and pawn 7, 5, right? These were the 4 ideas that came up to me right away. And actually the best option here was silver drop to 2, 7. Point being that we are trying to get the rook away from the protection of the knight. So even if, let's say, he plays rook to 3i, trying to keep protection of the knight, I can play silver to 2h promote, right? And now the rook no longer has a safe square on the third file. If it moves away, I can take the knight, and this token is really, really powerful, right? The attack connects very well. Unfortunately, the idea that I played in the actual game, silver drop 4i, is arguably the worst option out of the 4 ideas. So definitely a learning point for me also, and I hope for the viewers. The point is that the silver drop, which I played in the actual game, right? Yes, it's a nice little exchange of the silver and gold, but at the same time, it gives my opponent a silver in hand. And at this situation, there is still not a clear, decisive attack that I can make, that Rangerook can make here to win the game. And so giving up a silver to send this piece stamp is actually quite dangerous. But anyway, it continued with pawn takes promote, bishop takes. And at this moment, now Static is threatening a very nasty idea. Let's say if I just do nothing here, my opponent is going to take this silver, which comes with check. And after I take it, he opens up a discovery on the rook, so he can take on 3-4, and this will be losing for me. So because of that, I had to watch out for this discovery attack. And so in the actual game, I went for a pawn drop 3h, just a little nice in-between move. And after rook takes, pawn drop here. Now point is, after silver takes, if silver takes, I can play knight drop to 2-5, and this is a very good game. Now his bishop cannot move because then the rook falls. And even if he tries to drop a pawn here, attacking my rook, I can take the bishop first, and this time it is attacking the rook also on 3h. So that was the meaning of this pawn drop here. Is to draw the rook a little bit closer to the bishop so that if it does indeed take with the silver, right, this time the Polar Knight's attack also connects with the rook, right? So if it takes it, I can also take the rook. This is game over for my opponent. Right, in the actual game, my opponent played a really good shobute. That's what it's called in Japanese, but basically it's a very good fighting move, right? He plays bishop drop to 6-1. And the thing is that it's actually really dangerous for Rangerook to play this position. He has to be a little bit careful. I mentioned in the actual game that generally I don't like to move away from this fox, and I prefer to just attack as aggressively as possible. The problem is that if I go ahead with pawn drop 4-7 promote, My opponent actually has this idea once again. Now that his bishop's diagonal is open, he can play bishop takes with check, silver takes, rook takes, and now this position is getting really dangerous for me. My opponent has two silvers, a rook in hand. His other rook is coming to promote. His bishop is threatening to take my gold. So well, I mean, with perfect play, with perfect calculation, this is still winning for Gote. But in practice, I think this is too dangerous to allow. And so I played the safer move, which is to just go rook to 3-1. And then the reason why this move is so good is that he can now eliminate one of the crucial defenders of my castle and draw my king closer to the battlefield, right? So now my king is put closer to the battlefield, and at this timing he offers a rook trade. I think this is a very good idea. This is forcing, so I went for it. And then after bishop drop here, it went go here and go check here, here, and here. In the actual game, I mentioned that I could not promote the bishop to 3-6. That will be a blunder. So I'll just quickly show it. If I promoted the bishop to 3-6 instead, my opponent will drop a rook, comes with check, and attacks my horse. So this is game over, right? I lose my horse. So Shogi is still a very tricky game. You have to be really precise even up to the end, right? I promoted the bishop to here. And I also want to mention that during the game, I was thinking about rook drop ideas from my opponents, right? Let's say he drops a rook check in here. And I mentioned that against this rook check, I plan to defend with pawn drop on 4-2. Point is, if I had moved the silver, let's say to 6-2, at this stage, the gold on 6-3 becomes overworked. It's trying to guard the silver up here. It's also trying to guard the silver down here. So our opponent can distract the gold, right, by sacking his bishop. And after gold recaptures, it's no longer guarding the silver on 6-2. So my opponent could drop a gold check here. And this can become really, really dangerous for me. If I take it, the rook can take the silver with promotion, and this will be losing for ranging rook already, I think. And so that's why the safer way to do it was to drop the pawn here. That was what was on my mind when I was discussing it. But in the actual game, he played pawn drop 3-6. Again, I cannot take it because of this rook drop check. And here I slightly made a mistake. At first, I thought that I could drop the rook here, point being that after gold drop here, I could just sack the rook for the gold and then drop the gold here. So I'll just quickly show it. It's a little bit embarrassing, but this is the little bit of miscalculation that I did. I actually thought this was checkmate, but I failed to notice that the pawn on 3-6 actually blocks the horse's control of 6i. So here my opponent would move the king away, and now is again very, well, maybe it's not yet losing, but very dangerous for me. So in the actual game, after noticing that this rook drop doesn't work, I push the pawn here, right? I play pawn 6-6, and now the threat is, well, let's just like quickly run through it. Let's say he does nothing. The threat now is to drop a rook. After he defends with the gold, I can discard the rook and I can promote the pawn here. This is a decisive attack because it threatens gold drop 7h checkmate, and my opponent cannot recapture this token because then the gold loses protection of the 7h square, so this is still checkmate. So that was my threat when I push this pawn to 6-6. If he take it, this doesn't really work well. I can drop a knight. If it goes over to 6i, I can drop a rook here. This is checkmate. And if it takes this, I can drop a rook also. Check, and I'll pick up the silver. And this is, again, a decisive attack. So my opponent played the best defense, which is to drop another piece on 7h, which at this stage things get really hard for me already, because if my attack slows down, right, if I do not keep up a really fast and aggressive attack, my king is also not very safe. So really props to my opponent. He played the endgame really well. He really pushed me to my limits and forced me to make a couple of really difficult decisions. I could not slow down my attack because of how weak my king is. That's why I immediately went for rook drop 3i, sacking the rook, dropping the gold here, taking this pawn, forking the bishop. And we reach this position here where my opponent dropped a rook and silver here. And this is the decisive moment of the game. My opponent played gold drop to 5-2, which I noticed doesn't actually threaten checkmate, which is why I just ignored this attack and I went bishop drop to 3-5. Very simple, threatmate, attacking on the gold. And this is really just on the wire, right? My king is just barely surviving this attack, even though my opponent has 2 rooks. And the fact that this h-pawn push, right, happened in the early game is huge, because let's say he goes rook promotes check, king runs, rook drop, king runs, right? Now the king is able to run up to this little escape route, and unfortunately my opponent does not have a diagonal piece. So a diagonal piece is either a silver or a bishop. So he can't drop a diagonal piece here to continue checking the king. So actually this king is safe, and even with 2 rooks in my opponent's hand, this is barely no checkmate. So yeah, it was a close endgame. But after my opponent decided that he could not checkmate my king, he tried to defend. At this stage, it was too late. The last decisive move was probably knight 4-7, and that was the end of the game. Yeah. I also quickly mentioned that the moment my opponent drops the rook for defense, it became my king became really safe already. There's no more rook drop checks on 7-1 to worry about. So let's say even if he defended this with silver takes, I can just go ahead, discarding my bishop, hopelessly surrounding my opponent's king from all directions. And because he doesn't have the rook in his hand, he can't drop it here. So my king is very safe. This is game over. All right, I think that's all to be discussed about regarding this game. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you guys soon. Thank you.